September 29th, 1957. 4:20 p.m. The Mayak Chemical Combine, Southern Urals, Soviet Union. A storage tank containing approximately 70 to 80 tons of highly radioactive nuclear waste exploded. The explosion was not nuclear, it was chemical, caused by the evaporation and concentration of ammonium nitrate complexes in waste that had been slowly drying for over a year due to a broken cooling system. The force was equivalent to approximately 70 to 100 tons of TNT. It destroyed the concrete bunker containing the tank, blew a 1,000-ton roof section 40 meters into the air, and released somewhere between 20 and 50 million curies of radioactivity into the air above the Southern Urals. Workers on site were thrown off their feet. A tower-like plume of smoke and dust rose above the facility. And then, for the next 2 hours, Soviet authorities did absolutely nothing to warn the people living downwind. This event is known as the Kyshtym disaster. It is rated level 6 on the International Nuclear Events Scale, one level below Chernobyl. It contaminated approximately 23,000 square kilometers of Soviet territory. It has been called by the scientists who study it the nuclear disaster that the Soviet Union successfully hid from the world for 32 years. And the way it was hidden tells you as much about the disaster as the explosion itself. Most people who know about Chernobyl do not know about Kyshtym. This is not an accident. Chernobyl happened in 1986, after Glasnost had begun to open Soviet information systems. It was photographed, reported, and became a global news event in spite of initial Soviet attempts at concealment. Kyshtym happened in 1957, at the height of the Cold War, in the most classified industrial complex in the Soviet Union, producing plutonium for nuclear weapons. When it happened, the Soviet government did not need to manage international media coverage. They simply erased it. The city of Chelyabinsk, 6'5", where the Mayak facility was located, did not appear on Soviet maps. It did not have a publicly known name. The nearest visible city, Kyshtym, was 40 kilometers away, which is why the disaster takes its name from a town that had nothing to do with it. The workers and the people of the surrounding area who were contaminated and evacuated were told in many cases that there had been a chemical accident. They were not told it was nuclear. They were not told about radiation. Some of them were not evacuated for 10 days after the explosion. And when a Soviet dissident scientist finally broke the story in the West in 1976, the CIA, which had known about the explosion almost immediately from aerial reconnaissance, chose not to confirm it, because confirming it would have revealed the existence of their spy programs over Soviet territory. 3 things about Kyshtym that define how a government buries a nuclear disaster. The first, the cooling system on tank number 14, the tank that exploded, had been broken for 15 months before the explosion. The broken cooling system was documented in at least 7 written reports submitted to facility management between June 1956 and September 1957. The reports noted that the tank's temperature could not be regulated, that the contents were evaporating and concentrating, and that this created a potentially hazardous situation. All 7 reports were received. None of them resulted in a repair. The facility was running under intense production pressure to meet weapons-grade plutonium quotas for the Soviet nuclear weapons program. Shutting down a tank for repairs meant reducing output. Output took priority. The tank exploded. The second, the workers who built and operated the Mayak facility in the late 1940s and early 1950s were not told they were working with nuclear materials. Many of them were prisoners or civilian workers recruited from collective farms in the surrounding region. They worked in conditions of intense secrecy, without protective equipment, without dosimetry, without any information about what the materials they were handling would do to their bodies. The cancer rates, birth defect rates, and mortality statistics for the population of workers who built Mayak were classified. They remained classified until 1989. When they were finally released under Gorbachev, the numbers were so far outside normal ranges that Soviet public health officials initially refused to accept them as genuine. The third, the contamination plume from the Kyshtym explosion, designated the East Ural radioactive trace, extended approximately 300 kilometers to the northeast of the facility, in a band approximately 8 to 9 kilometers wide, affecting approximately 270,000 people. Villages within this plume were evacuated over the following weeks and months, but not all of them, and not quickly. For the villages that were evacuated, the official explanation given to residents was, in most cases, that there had been an unspecified emergency requiring their temporary relocation. They were told to leave their belongings, their food, their livestock. They were not told why. Many of them never returned. The settlements were bulldozed. The land was fenced. For 30 years, the East Ural radioactive trace did not officially exist. The Mayak chemical combine was one of the most important and most secret facilities in the Soviet Union. Established in 1945, immediately after the American atomic bomb tests at Alamogordo and Hiroshima, Mayak was the cornerstone of the Soviet nuclear weapons program. Its primary mission was the production of plutonium-239, the fissile material required for implosion-type nuclear weapons. Through the irradiation of uranium in purpose-built reactors and the subsequent chemical separation of the resulting plutonium from the reactor fuel. The construction of Mayak was conducted under conditions of extraordinary secrecy and extraordinary speed. Stalin had made clear that the development of a Soviet nuclear weapon was the top priority of the state, superseding virtually all other considerations. The Chelyabinsk 4-0 facility, the original classification designation for the complex, was built in the southern Urals, a location chosen for its distance from potential Western attack vectors and for the availability of local rivers for cooling water. The workers who built Mayak came from several sources. A substantial portion were prisoners from the Gulag system. Others were civilian workers recruited or conscripted from surrounding regions. All of them worked under conditions of near-total information blackout. The nature of the work, the materials involved, the radiation hazards, the long-term health consequences was not disclosed. The workers were told they were building a chemical facility. Some of them were told more specifically that they were working on a defense project of national importance. Almost none of them were told about radiation. The health consequences for the early Mayak workforce were severe and well documented in classified Soviet files that were not accessible to researchers until the early 1990s. Acute radiation syndrome, cancers of multiple types at rates far above population baselines, reproductive abnormalities. All of these were observed, recorded in medical files that were maintained separately from normal healthcare records, and never shared with the workers affected or their families. By 1949, Mayak had successfully produced the material for the Soviet Union's first nuclear weapons test. By the early 1950s, it was one of the largest plutonium production facilities in the world, running multiple reactors simultaneously. It also generated enormous quantities of high-level radioactive waste, the liquid byproducts of plutonium separation, intensely radioactive, thermally hot, chemically complex, and extraordinarily difficult to manage safely. The initial Soviet approach to high-level waste management was not sophisticated. Large quantities were discharged directly into the nearby Teka River, the primary water source, for communities downstream that used it for drinking water, bathing, and irrigation. This continued for several years before the downstream contamination became severe enough to force a different approach. The Teka River discharges alone are estimated to have contaminated approximately 124,000 people, some of whom received doses high enough to cause clinically significant radiation-related illness. The subsequent approach was to store high-level liquid waste in large stainless steel tanks, set in concrete bunkers below ground, cooled with constantly circulating water to prevent the radioactive decay heat from raising the temperature of the waste to dangerous levels. This approach required continuous maintenance of the cooling systems. If a cooling system failed, the waste would begin to evaporate. As it evaporated, the concentration of radioactive materials increased, and as certain chemical compounds in the waste concentrated, they became reactive in new ways. Tank number 14 at the Site 25 storage facility received a fault in its cooling circuit sometime in June 1956. The cooling water supply to that tank was interrupted. The temperature of the contents began rising. Routine inspection protocols at the facility should have identified this within days. Maintenance protocols should have resulted in rapid repair. Neither happened. The reasons appear to be a combination of factors. Production pressures that prioritize reactor operation over maintenance. A culture of underreporting safety problems up the chain of command, because reporting problems was associated with personal career consequences, and a fragmented responsibility structure in which no single person had clear accountability for the cooling status of tank number 14. The 7 written reports that documented the broken cooling system between June 1956 and September 1957 are preserved in the Soviet nuclear archives that were partially declassified in the 1990s. They are matter-of-fact documents. They note the elevated temperature of the tank, the failure of the cooling circuit, the increasing evaporation of the waste, and the associated risk. They recommend repair. In several cases, they specifically note that the situation is dangerous. They were received by facility management. They resulted in no action. On the afternoon of September 29, 1957, the temperature in tank number 14 had reached approximately 350 degrees Celsius. The evaporated and concentrated waste, primarily nitrate and acetate compounds, complex with radioactive materials, had reached the conditions for an exothermic decomposition reaction. At 4:20 p.m., the tank exploded. The explosion was not a nuclear detonation, but what it released into the air above the southern Urals was something that the people downwind were not equipped, not warned, and not allowed to understand. Approximately 20 to 50 million curies of radioactivity carried northeast on the wind, settling invisibly onto the fields, the rivers, the villages, and the people of the East Ural region. The nearest village to the Mayak facility was 11 kilometers away. The contamination plume reached 300 kilometers. In between 23,000 square kilometers of Soviet territory became, without its inhabitants knowing it, one of the most contaminated areas on Earth. The initial Soviet response to the explosion was, by any standard, inadequate. Emergency personnel at the facility began working to contain the immediate damage. The site itself, Chelyabinsk 6-5, the closed city, was placed under intensified restrictions. Workers who had been in the area of the explosion were decontaminated and in some cases hospitalized. The contamination plume drifting northeast was not, in the first hours, treated as an emergency requiring public warning or protective action. No broadcasts were made to the communities in the plume's path. No instructions were issued about staying indoors, avoiding locally grown food, or not drinking from rivers. People in the villages downwind of Mayak went to bed on the evening of September 29, 1957, knowing nothing. In the days that followed, Some villages in the most heavily contaminated parts of the plume were evacuated. The process was not fast, not systematic, and not well explained to the people being moved. Residents were typically told to leave their homes quickly, taking only their documents and some clothing. They were told to leave their livestock. They were told to leave their food supplies, their household goods, their furniture. They were told this was temporary, that they would be able to return, that there had been an accident requiring precautionary measures. Most of them never returned. Over the following months, the evacuated villages were demolished. The land was fenced with plain wire fencing and marked with signs that did not specify the reason for the restriction. Some signs said no entry. Some areas were simply enclosed without signs at all. The East Ural State Reserve, a supposedly protected natural area, was established over part of the contamination zone. It was not a nature reserve in any meaningful sense. It was a contaminated zone with a cover story. The contamination of the Taka River drainage basin, which had already been occurring from direct waste discharges for years before the 1957 explosion, was compounded by runoff from the fallout zone. Fish, water, crops, milk, all contaminated, some severely. The populations living on the Taka and its tributaries received additional radiation doses from the 1957 event, on top of the doses they had already been accumulating from the earlier discharges. Zhores Medvedev was a Soviet biologist, not a dissident in the conventional political sense, but a scientist who believed that scientific truth should be communicable, regardless of political inconvenience. In 1976, living in exile in London, after being forcibly expelled from the Soviet Union, he published an account of the Kyshtym explosion in The New Scientist. He had pieced the story together from Soviet scientific publications, papers on the ecology of contaminated lakes, studies of radioactive isotope distribution in the southern Urals, papers on radiation effects in animal populations that, taken together, pointed unmistakably to a major nuclear contamination event in the region sometime in the late 1950s. The response from the Western nuclear establishment was, in several notable cases, to deny that the event had occurred at all. Several senior British and American nuclear officials publicly stated that Medvedev's account was impossible or implausible. The CIA, which had aerial reconnaissance photographs of the facility taken in the days after the 1957 explosion, said nothing. Confirming Medvedev's account would have required acknowledging the existence of the U-2 spy plane overflights that had captured the imagery, overflights that were, at the time, officially denied. The official Soviet acknowledgement of the Kyshtym disaster did not come until 1989 under Mikhail Gorbachev's Glasnost program. The partial opening of Soviet nuclear archives that followed allowed researchers for the first time to begin assembling a comprehensive picture of what had happened. The health data that emerged from those archives, cancer incidence rates, mortality statistics, birth defect rates for the populations of the contamination zone, confirmed what Medvedev and a handful of other scientists had been arguing for years. The Mayak facility continues to operate. It is now used primarily for the reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel and the management of legacy waste from the Soviet nuclear weapons program. The contamination zone around the facility remains one of the most radioactively contaminated areas on Earth. The Taka River, into which waste was discharged for years in the late 1940s and early 1950s, remains contaminated today, decades after the discharges were stopped. The 7 reports about the broken cooling system on tank number 14 are in the archives. The names of the people who received those reports and took no action are in the archives. The production quotas that created the pressure under which those reports were ignored are in the archives. All of it is documented. None of the individuals responsible were ever prosecuted. The Soviet nuclear program was a state program. Prosecuting the individuals would have meant prosecuting the state 32 years of silence, 23,000 square kilometers of contaminated land, and a broken cooling system that 7 reports said needed to be fixed. The long-term ecological consequences of the Kyshtym explosion have been studied more systematically since the 1990s than during the Soviet period, when research was classified and results were not published in accessible form. The studies that have emerged paint a picture of persistent multi-generational contamination in the affected areas. The East Ural State Reserve, the contaminated zone designated as a nature preserve, has been used since the 1960s as an inadvertent field laboratory for the study of chronic radiation exposure in wild animal and plant populations. The results have been scientifically interesting and humanly troubling. Some species show elevated mutation rates. Others show adaptive responses over generations. The data is specific to the southern Urals ecosystem and the particular mix of isotopes deposited by the Kyshtym explosion, making generalizations difficult. But the existence of that data, gathered in a zone that Soviet authorities maintained was simply a nature preserve, is itself a form of evidence about what the authorities knew was there. The Teka River remains elevated in certain radioactive isotopes today. Populations living along its banks, including communities that were never evacuated, received chronic low-level radiation doses over decades. Epidemiological studies of those populations, conducted primarily by the Urals Research Center for Radiation Medicine in Chelyabinsk, have documented elevated rates of leukemia and other cancers that are statistically associated with the radiation exposure. The studies were classified until 1989. They have since been published and have contributed to the international scientific understanding of the health effects of chronic low-level radiation exposure. The Mayak facility itself continues to operate, managed by the Russian state nuclear corporation Rosatom. It is the primary reprocessing facility for spent nuclear fuel from Russian power plants and under various agreements from other countries. It remains one of the most contaminated industrial sites in the world, not because of ongoing practices, but because of the accumulated legacy of 6 decades of nuclear materials processing. Remediation of the site and the surrounding area is an ongoing project that is expected to continue for generations. The village of Metlino, one of the communities on the Teka River that received among the highest radiation doses from the early waste discharges, was evacuated and demolished in the 1950s. Its residents were relocated. Some of them lived long enough to see the declassified health data confirm what many had suspected for decades, that the illnesses that ran through their community were not coincidences or bad luck, but the documented consequence of the facility whose existence had been hidden from them. The 7 reports about the broken cooling system on tank number 14 are available to researchers in the Russian Federation's nuclear archives. The names of the facility managers who received them are in those records. None of those individuals were prosecuted. The Soviet system did not prosecute the state for decisions made in the service of the state's nuclear weapons program. The political calculus of the Cold War overrode every other consideration. The people who wrote the reports warning about the tank did what they were supposed to do. The people who received the reports and did nothing did what the system made it easy to do. And the people who lived downwind of Mayak on September 29th, 1957, paid for decisions that were made by people whose names they never knew. If you want to understand how governments bury nuclear disasters, not through force, but through silence, classification, and the very specific decision never to tell the people they need to know, subscribe. Every week, a story that was hidden in plain sight.